Welcome to the Karuna Life, the podcast where we explore the connection between spirituality and everyday life. I'm Gina Kitzmiller. I'm a professional intuitive, a Reiki master teacher, and a longtime spiritual seeker. Join me as we dive into topics like living a heart-centered life, connecting with our intuition, and unleashing our own power. We'll discuss the metaphysical world, spirit guides, and finding magic in the ordinary. Get ready to embrace your inner mystic and explore the realms of the unseen. Welcome to the Karuna Life. I'm Gina Kitzmiller. And today's episode is titled Coffee with Ghost. And it's unusual that I have the title before I record the episode, but this definitely was coming through loud and clear, and it has been on my heart to record this episode. And I wanted to do it before the holidays. So, Coffee with Ghost, we are going to talk about a practice that I developed after my husband passed away. And I'm going to explain why I found it helpful, give you some suggestions if it's something you would like to adopt into your own practice. And then we're going to talk about having coffee with ghosts that are maybe outside of our family members or loved ones. So, this is going to be an interesting topic, and let's get started. Now, as always, I want to remind everyone that these are my experiences, these are my beliefs. So I always invite you to simply take what resonates with you. And then if something doesn't, you just set it to the side. So, how I started having coffee with Ghost is initially after my husband passed away. I really wanted a way to connect in with him. At the time, I wasn't able to really communicate with him in the same way that I do now. And I was really missing that connection. And I knew he was with me in spirit, but I wanted something physical. I wanted something to help me to feel like he wasn't separate from me. And so I started this kind of secret practice. I didn't tell anybody I was doing it, but I would put my kids on the bus and then I would come back into my kitchen, make a strong cup of coffee, and I would sit down at my kitchen table. And sometimes I would light a candle or I would set Joe's picture on the table on the chair opposite of me. Sometimes I would even pour him a cup of coffee. And I would just sit and talk with him, just like I would if he was in the physical with me. And it's obviously was a one-sided conversation because I wasn't feeling like I was getting a response back from him at that time. But this practice really became a way for me to feel like he was still with me and to feel that connection. And so I would tell him what was going on with the kids. I would tell him about my day. There were days that I would just sit and cry and not really say anything at all and just allow that pain to come out or to tell him I was really angry with him. I just would say whatever I needed to say. And any of you who have experienced grief, much less grief by suicide, there is such a wide range of emotions that we feel, right? We feel guilty one moment, we might feel angry the next, we might feel extreme sadness and sorrow. And grief really becomes these ocean waves that just kind of roll through, and we don't really know what's coming next until that wave hits. So, this was a way for me to really express my emotions. I didn't censor them. I mean, I certainly didn't attack him, but I was very honest about what I was feeling when I was frustrated. And then eventually, as I moved through the grief process, the conversations began to change. They became more of me asking questions about the kids, asking him for help with parenting or something that I was struggling with. And eventually, I've kind of transferred them now. I still occasionally will call him forward with a cup of coffee, usually if something is really weighing on my mind. But I talk with him in the car all the time. I have a conversation with him. And so my guides are actually chiming in and nudging me to tell kind of a lighter story. And that is that a few years ago, I was going to pick my son up from his first girlfriend's house. And I think this was the first time I was picking him up from a girl's house. And I was driving out there and I called Joe forward in the car and I was just talking with him and just saying, gosh, who would have thought, like, he's in middle school now. And I really wish you were here with me because this feels like kind of momentous. I'm picking him up from his girlfriends. We've started a new chapter with him in his life. And it was a lighthearted conversation. And I offhandedly said to Joe, my kids had called him lots of nicknames. They called him Dacha, was one that they liked when they were little. And I said, gosh, I don't really have a nickname for you because Joe often refers to me as G. And I said, I've always just called him Joe. And so I said, I really wish I had had like some sort of nickname for you. I guess, I hadn't really thought about it until now. And then I was thinking about the kids' nicknames and said, gosh, they called you Dacha and they also called you Big Daddy Joe. And I started laughing to myself and I said, well, I can't call you like Big Daddy because that just sounds kind of odd to me. Right. And so I giggled about it and just continued on my drive. And I pulled into Jonah's girlfriend's house. And so I'm sitting in this dark driveway waiting for him to come out. And several minutes passed, and I just was sitting in the car waiting. And a car pulls up behind me, and her brother gets out of the car and goes to walk into the house. And he's carrying hockey gear and he's got this hockey jersey on. And lo and behold, on the back of the jersey, it says Big Daddy. No joke. And I just started laughing because I saw that it was a sign that Joe was letting me know he was with me in that moment. Even though this wasn't a huge event, it was something that I really wanted him present with me. And I don't know if I even told my son that story, but it always just lightened my heart that even in those moments that may seem a little bit more day to day, very much still present for it. And that was his way of letting me know that he was there with me. So it's always interesting to me when we lose loved ones. I think a lot of us do talk to them in our own way, but we often don't share that with other people. And I'm kind of curious as to why that is. I've noticed that in sessions with clients, when someone's passed away, I'll often make the suggestion, well, have you, talk to your dad in the car, or maybe you should pour them a cup of coffee. And people will say, oh, I do talk to him. I talk to him when I'm driving or when I'm doing laundry. And so it's a way that we really do keep them close. But I think it's very interesting that it's something that we don't really share with other people. We kind of keep a little bit of secrecy, much like I did around those early morning coffees with Joe after he died. And yet for me, I would say that was one of the healthiest practices that I had during those first few months because it was a way for me to still feel very much connected with him in spirit. And we're learning to navigate a new relationship with them. But make no mistake, there is still a relationship, even with those who are in spirit. It just doesn't look the way that it did in the physical. And that's one of the hard things for us to navigate, right? For those of us who feel like we're quote unquote left behind, right? I know that feeling very well. And we're learning to communicate with them in different ways. We're learning that their communication is going to look a little bit different, obviously, than it did in the physical. And I always say it doesn't take away that pain of wanting someone in the physical, wanting to give them a physical hug. I absolutely understand that, right? If we each had our own wish or desire, of course, that's going to be what we would like. And yet it's also learning, okay, I'm not going to get that as far as I know right now. So how do I learn to develop new practices? How do I develop a new relationship with this person or being or spirit that I loved so much in the physical world? And when we're talking about spirits, I think it's very interesting about Earth is such a dualistic place. They always say this is the planet of duality. And we start that with kids from a very young age, right? I remember reading with my son books when he was 3 about opposites and teaching him that it has to be black, it has to be white, this is cold, this is hot. And as I've grown in spirituality and really started to learn about the world of spirit, I learned that oftentimes things are in the middle, or sometimes they're even a little bit of both. It's not quite as easy as that dualistic belief can be. And my guides often remind me of that as well, that oftentimes something can be both. They can still be with us and not here in the physical, right? So I would suggest the practice of coffee with ghost really anytime. I think around the holidays, it can be incredibly helpful. I think around the Day of the Dead in early November. We have solstice coming up. The veil is going to be thin. So if there was a time that you would like to sit down and have a cup of coffee with a friend or a loved one in spirit, it would be a really good time to do it. Make sure that you set your intention beforehand, right? So it's just like picking up the phone. We want to make sure we know who we're calling and we're setting the intention to speak with them. And if you think about it, how many times have you thought about a friend or a loved one and then the phone rings and it's them? The intention was there. So, when we start to talk about having coffee with ghosts, I also wanted to expand this a little bit beyond our loved ones for those of you who are intuitive or feel like this is an area that you wanted to explore. So I have now had kind of an odd practice. I laugh because my boyfriend Jeff has just learned to kind of roll with this. But we have visited places, and there's very distinct energy in the house where we're staying at an Airbnb. That you could feel the energy. I actually got woke up by a spirit when we stayed in Bluffton, South Carolina. So these places do hold energies. So how this first started was when we went to stay at a certain place, there was a distinct impression of a woman, and she was not happy that we were in her space, right? It was a very old home. And the energy and emotion that hit as soon as you walked in was, don't touch my stuff, and I don't want you in here. So we kind of went about our way. And the next morning I thought, you know what? I'm gonna just pour her a cup of coffee, right? Like, and just explain to her, hey, we're just passing through. We're not gonna touch anything. We'll mind our own business and then we'll be on our way. And I'm really sorry that it's uncomfortable for you. So I did that and I felt like the energy shifted. Now, I'm not going to say that she liked us because I don't think she did, but she was tolerable. And so I've developed and taken that practice and I've used it a few times. And so it's certain places where I feel like there's an energy in the house. I pour a cup of coffee for myself, I pour one for them, and I sit down. And in Bluffton, it was really just sitting with the energy. It was really just me sitting with this gentleman and just holding space for him. I was asking my guides about this, and they were saying to notice that when I do this, I'm not trying to fix the spirit or the being. Do I help spirits cross over? Yes, I do. But I don't come into someone's home and demand that they quote unquote go to the light because that's infringing upon their free will. If they're still here, then there's something that their soul would like for them to still be learning. And so I always try to kind of stay in my lane, and so my guides had said to pay attention because I don't try to fix them. I'm just there to kind of hold space and to let them know in acknowledgement of, I know you're here. I see you. Here's an offering with a cup of coffee. And then oftentimes just leaving it at that. Sometimes, especially with new intuitives, they want to come into a space and they want to be really helpful and they want to clear the space. And that can be really demanding that someone, something go into the light, you have to leave. And yet they were there before you arrived. And they compared it to someone barging into your house and demanding that you leave. What's your first response? You're going to be irritable, angry. You're going to be defiant and not do what they're asking you to do because you're feeling like you're pressured into it. So I always try to kind of lean into my intuition of, what am I being asked to do here? Is this my role? Is there something that I need to do? And is this, of course, for my highest good? That's always what you want to ask. Just because you can observe or acknowledge someone in spirit doesn't mean that it's always your role to do so. Doesn't mean it's always in your best interest or their best interest. So you want to make sure that you ask that question. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is that I believe that as we move into these coming years, 2025 and beyond, more and more people are going to be able to sense those in spirit. And you might be traveling, you might be on a vacation, much like we were in an Airbnb or someplace, and you're going to realize that there is another energy there. And we're going to need to learn to start to navigate that, right? Navigate that with awareness, with kindness, and with compassion for these beings, because it's going to become, I think, a much more common occurrence than what it has been previously. So I'm asking my guides if there's anything that they would like to chime in on this one. And they're reminding me one that there are certain times of the year, like Day of the Dead, winter solstice, where the veils are thinner. It's a little bit easier, they're saying, for loved ones or those in spirit to communicate. So you might want to pay attention to that if that's something that your heart's really asking for. They're saying to pay attention for signs around those times that can actually be really helpful. And they want or they're asking us to start to really think about the narrative around our loved ones in spirit. There's some very old paradigms that we've had for ages that are going to start to really be questioned, to shift, to grow, and to evolve as our awareness of those in spirit, of the spiritual world, continues to grow and evolve. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers. I'm simply giving the information as I'm getting it. And so it's going to be really up to each one of us to take what resonates, to take a look at the information, ask ourselves what feels right to us. That certainly does not mean that you have to be in agreement with me or anyone else that you hear. You choose what's right for you, what feels right for you. And they're reminding us, as they did before in the grief process, there is no right or wrong. And they said that if you choose to start a practice like having coffee with your loved one in spirit, they want you to ask yourself, how does this make me feel? If it makes you feel closer and more connected to them, then you want to lean into that. If it makes you feel separate and you find that you're crying more and your heart is just aching and it really seems like it's kicked up the grief rather than help to calm it, then they're saying that's probably not the best practice for you at that time. So you might choose to set it aside. You might come back to it down the road, but there's no pressure if it's something that doesn't quite fit for you. And they're saying that doesn't mean there's anything quote unquote wrong with you either, if that's the case. They're saying, do you like coffee or do you like tea? It's just one or the other. One isn't better than the other. They're just two different things. So I hope that you found this helpful. As always, those of you who are grieving during the holidays, my heart is with you. I also want to point out that grief comes up, whether it has been 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, 15, 20. It's just a never ending process, unfortunately. I remember when my guides told me there was never going to be a finish line in grief and that it was something that I would experience off and on throughout the rest of my life. Now, my human part was kind of like, oh, you've got to be kidding me because it's so painful when you're in it. And yet, that is the truth of it, right? It is just something that kind of ebbs and flows as we move through life. And I feel that if we can start to really explore the world of spirit, explore the world where our loved ones are, so to speak, because they're not separate from us, that we can really begin to develop new relationships with them, ones that makes us feel that they are connected with us, that we feel supported, and that we know in our hearts our loved ones are walking with us every day. So I hope that that helps. If you have any comments, you can email me, Gina at the Karuna Life. And as always, if you like this podcast, please consider following us or leaving us 5 stars. We'd be really grateful. Have a wonderful holiday season, and I will see all of you back in the new year.